Hello everyone, today we talk about the campaigns of the German Peasants War. I made a video last month describing the armies of the German Peasants War, mostly in fact the one of the Swabian League that was called to crush the peasants, and the latter's forces that, as we've seen, chronically lacked cohesion, organization, material means. If anything, they were pretty large, given the widespread desperation that had brought to this major uprising that risked to engulf, in fact, much more of Germany than it actually did, and that in fact was concluded mostly because of the peasants' lack of general awareness and coordination into a massive slaughter, possibly reaching up to 100,000 that in pre-industrial times in certain areas of Central Europe really means a lot, right? I promised you that I would start talking about early modern historical, say, manualistic topics to introduce better like the broader temporary times. You know that I have a branch of the cycle dedicated to early modern Habsburgic history that we will also keep looking at. That of course intertwines with this kind of video. These years are really crucial. 1524, 25. We've seen also in the videos about the Italian wars that obviously, like the Battle of Pavia and the major imperial effort in northern Italy, had distracted many Landsknechten from this southern German uprising that could be quelled mostly only when these veterans came back north of the Alps, some actually joining the peasants' cause, as we will see now. So it's really a very intricate topic that we can make sense of, if anything, just region by region, land by land in Germany, because otherwise the story is very complicated. Most of the motivations of the peasants we also explained in the previous video, but when we make a military history, we know as Clausewitzians that we can't quite simply cut dryly like just to the warfare of the situation. We have to understand the motivations, the political mandate, in essence. That is also the one that brings, in some cases also, not really unexpectedly, maybe for those who participate into these clashes, but in a way that is not really historically reconstructible or explainable, much like the motivations of single leaders, for example, participating in the rebellion. People of different estates, as we've seen, noblemen, saying Landsknechten, and other figures that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be from the peasant side, right? There is the Reformation, the background that, of course, is a big component to this all. But again, for all this, I just address you to the previous videos. If you haven't watched it, I will link it in the related videos down below. But let's get to the campaigns that are really fascinating in their similarity but also difference, and in this sort of variegated German landscape of the early 16th century. So we can start from Stühlingen, Waldshut, and the Hellgau. Right, we're essentially in lower Swabia. And during the harvest of 1524, we have the significant disturbance occurring in Stühlingen, where approximately 1,200 peasants mobilized under the leadership of a Landsknecht soldier, Hans Müller von Bulgenbach, which really marked a pivotal moment in the Peasants' War. Is conventionally intended as a beginning of the same, and of course the presence of the Landsknechten, not just as final rank soldiers but as leaders of the revolt in some cases, is very fascinating. We talked about the Landsknechten and we observed how this represented essentially a military estate within the Holy Roman Empire that was very much tied to the older sense of the Cingulum Militaris, of the traditional imperial military mandate of, in fact, imperial soldiery that represented, especially in this, say, Ancien Regime era, like from after the late medieval crisis, an enormous redemptional chance for essentially people coming from peasant background that, but just by enlisting in imperial army, could gain like this higher status, of which they were incredibly proud, and that, however, put them in sort of contrasting, like ambiguous relation with the other estates. Because from one side, as we've seen also in other videos dedicated to early modern sort of military loyalty, there was always the problem of money, right? All early modern powers were chronically short of that. You have the Fugger that also are actually active here. You have later the Genoese Bank of St. George for the Habsburgic Empire, like financing this enormous military enterprises all across Europe, but still never being quite enough, and so often these troops mutinying. On the other side, like being in this context of the German peasants' revolt, siding with the peasants, knowing what that life was actually about, but also feeling some sort of Freudian repulsion towards that, because now these were soldiers that were really transfigured by the right of bearing arms in a country like Germany, in which basically virtually all people were somebody else's people. There wasn't really a concept of liberty as we intended sort of in the more Western part of Europe. It's a heavily feudal agricultural reality, and so there is this mix. From one side, the Landsknechten are hired by the Swabian League, by the same Habsburgs, to put down the peasant revolt. On some other instances, they actually lead it, like in the case of Bulgenbach. So concurrently to this uprising in Stühlingen, in Waldshut, the priest Balthasar Hubmeier led another group of peasants. When the authorities demanded Hubmeier's surrender, the Archduke Ferdinand of Habsburg, that had been left by his brother Charles V to deal with the German affairs, ordered the Swabian League in the west to advance against Waldshut. We are in August of 1524, intending to rally support from Swiss cities facing similar peasant uprisings. This is interesting because it shows you that regardless of the historical rivalries between the Habsburgs and, generally speaking, like the German subjects loyal to them and the Swiss Confederacy, there was, especially in that area, that was very frontier in this sense. I mean, the Swiss Confederacy had been born in similar ways, the ones of the same Swabian League, right? So other areas, especially in the western part of Germany, like the Rhineland, were very fragmented, didn't really have a strong sort of local authority to in fact cope with this sort of pretty transnational issue that is, taming such massive uprising and bringing things as they were before. As we've seen, cities were not really happy of this. They mostly helped the nobility, the establishment, to put the peasants down. So in response, Waldshut allied with the Stühlingen peasants, with 800 Stühlingen men entering the city in September, creating a notable union of rural and urban peasants that in this sense was normally an exception. We're talking naturally relatively modest centers, we're talking towns, if anything, and the peasant mob could at some point also overrun some of the towns just by, say, devastating the district, like the countryside, or simply turning the local peasants to their own cause. On September the 3rd, the League commanders recognized their inability to field sufficient troops, just not having money mostly, but also manpower, because most Landsknechts were serving, as we were noticing, in northern Italy under Georg von Frundsberg for Charles V against the French that were now to threaten Lombardy. The League thus attempted to delay confrontation through negotiation while trying to undermine the peasant leaders' support by offering higher pay for service in Italy. This is interesting because they were essentially luring them back into some kind of soldierly life at a higher pay, just to distract them from the local revolt. At the same time, there was a lot of sort of work behind the scenes, organization, like political negotiations, and also troop deployment that could prevent some further peasant uprising spread. As Waldshut remained unconquered, Upmeier returned to the city, and in Stühlingen peasants laid siege to the count's castle, but withdrew after 2 weeks due to the absence of heavy artillery. There was a great minus, in fact, in the peasants' armies. I made a video about the early modern German artillery from the time of Maximilian. And in our previous video about the German peasants' armies organization, we observed how artillery was really, scarce, especially from the peasant side, given the fact that the main infrastructures, main centers remained in to the establishment hands, but also the latter were not so plenty, right, of such material means, right? Artillery is, of course, like a major arm in the early 16th century, but these are not even though they are very rich areas by German standards. These uprisings at most did not happen in the more depressed areas that were firmly under feudal control. Here, like, the peasantry was more important given their role in agricultural labor. However, Renaissance artillery cost an enormous lot, right? And also the Swabian League did not really have, as we've seen, all the resources of the world, if anything, also from a financial point of view. But artillery also required all a particular logistical support, some specific technical skills, all an apparatus that could be able to sustain its employment. So here we find a typical strategical limit of the peasants: besieging castles but not having enough firepower to bring the defenders to surrender. Additional peasant mobilization occurred in Egau on October the 2nd, leading to the formation of a leadership council and further recruitment, swelling Bulgenbach's forces to 4,500, divided into 3 bands by early October. The peasants fought in interesting ways, like mostly these forces were like deployed in square too, like they fought more or less like in the pike and shot fashion. There were also smaller detachments. We see it here, they're not enormous numbers, especially considering that the peasants are lighter than a regular army, right? It's not much about the technique of fighting, but the actual quality of it. As we will see now, it's basically going to be a bloodbath, right, with the peasants hardly ever managing to stand their ground in open field and making it out as winners, or even alive for that matter. In response to these disturbances, local authorities convened a court to address grievances, which was basically what brought most, peasants' attention, because that's really what they wanted. They wanted to have better canons, right, as far as their agricultural service regime was entailed. Like, this had to be regulated by the noblemen. Some, remonstrations had been presented, like abuses had been denounced. So this resulted actually in most insurgents disarming, because to them, after all, that was a satisfactory political objective having been reached. However, it wasn't that simple, because naturally many of these people had, especially the leaders, had really been responsible for many crimes, much violence, and they preemptively remained in arms. In fact, Bulgenbach, skeptical, continued to seek support, where in November, and his forces began to dwindle to up to a few hundred due to winter conditions in the further months, right? And they were ultimately dispersed by a small League contingent at Donaueschingen on December the 14th, which gives you a dimension of how easily these forces could simply melt away, right? I think the League employed like 300 horsemen, 1,000 infantry, something like that. And so it didn't really take much. Like, you have this critical mass of, better equipped, more professional forces being able to melt away the core peasant forces in this area. Now, Upper Swabia is very interesting. It's one of the most intense theaters, right? General discontent persisted in the region, despite earlier grievances being addressed. And during winter, the Duke Ulrich of Württemberg assembled a force of approximately 6,000 foot soldiers and 300 cavalry, aiming to reclaim his territories that in part had been lost, like also due to previous feudal issues. So essentially siding with the peasants and posing a significant threat to the League, as well as to the House of Habsburg as the general imperial authority. His army comprised Landsknechten, Reisläufer, that is Swiss mercenaries, and a troop of peasants led by the aforementioned Bulgenbach, who broke camp at Hohenwil on February the 23rd and marched towards Stuttgart. However, Ulrich's advance faltered due to financial constraints and the withdrawal of the Swiss troops, significantly enough, disheartened by the news at this point of the heavy losses that their connationals had incurred at the Battle of Pavia, that had occurred in the same month, 1525, that, as you know, was a major butchery from the French side that employed large number of Swiss troops. So this is fascinating because you see even a noble participation with professional forces, so from the Swiss Confederacy, also siding against the Habsburgs, so mixing into the German affairs, from which they theoretically would have extricated themselves as a nation now, the newly born country. The imperial victory allowed Georg von Frundsberg to return to Germany with thousands of veteran Landsknechten, which the Swabian League found promising but required funding they lacked. Right? The Fuggers and the Welsers, prominent bankers of the empire at the time, intervened, providing Georg Truxas of Waldburg, a field commander appointed by the League in March 1525, with a war chest of 10,000 guilders. This amount, however, was only sufficient to cover the basic wages for 2,500 troops for 1 month, and the rest had just to be put together just by debt in a where in another. What is naturally very fascinating that we highlighted also in the previous videos, that of course the peasant uprising in Germany occurred, also exploiting this critical situation in southern Europe. Essentially, the Imperials had failed in their invasion of Provence against the Valois, that had counterattacked, invading Piedmont and threatening Milan, and that's where, in fact, the Battle of Pavia was fought, when the same King of France, Francis I, was taken prisoner by the Germans and the Spanish. So you realize the ideological, countercultural, fourth estate motivation of the peasants. We don't want to pay taxes. We want just to essentially sabotage the entire imperial cause just for our own, also not really clear plan about the aftermath of all this. And then you have, of course, civilization itself, the rich southern German bankers that are the same ones that finance the Habsburgs. The Fuggers in particular will go bankrupt actually in the enterprise, but still because of the obvious needs here to finance the army of the Swabian League that, as you understand, costs a freaking lot. Not even these, because these guys are located at Ulm, at Augsburg, so these are places that are being threatened from the Swabian peasants quite directly, and not even these guys can put together so much, right, to fund the leagues that, as you understand here, is underfunded, and so also more contained in numbers than it should be. While Ulrich preoccupied the League, so as we've seen, the ruler of Württemberg, basically deciding to side with the peasants, 3 new peasant bands mobilized in Upper Swabia. The situation escalates. The Kempten bishopric had experienced disturbances leading to a significant peasant uprising in the same year after failed negotiations. The peasants formed the so-called Christian Brotherhood, which aligned with the Allgäu Band, uniting under the call for divine justice, and so the utopistic, sort of reformistic backed, and often also communistic ideologies, anti-establishment, anti-authority, anti-order, etc. Under Jörg Schmidt's command, the Allgäu Band was actually well equipped and included artillery. Right, so as we've seen, the peasants would find the means, they would sack various fortresses, they would receive support from other actors. So this was not a force to be underestimated. Another group near Lake Constance, in fact known as the Lake Band, emerged with patrician leaders even. So these were essentially town establishments of some sort. Dietrich Urlewagen and Hans Jakob Umpis, attracting even returning Landsknechten from Italy and becoming, for this reason, thanks to the latter support, the best equipped peasant army in Upper Swabia. Remember, there is a bit of sort of a state social rivalry here. We've seen how, of course, miserable early modern soldierly life really was. I mean, the Landsknechten did have a status of some sort, but they wouldn't become particularly well-off people at all. Like, they witnessed this incredible misery during the campaigns. They would be heavily traumatized and socially alienated, and so many of these men were exactly the kind of scum that was needed by the peasants, if anything, because they had a consistent military experience and could also train the peasants to perform in a way or another. Naturally, the results were somehow pitiful, but still, right, these forces could not be ignored. The largest and most organized group gathered around Böblingen, amassing around 10,000 men, led by the aforementioned Ulrich Schmidt, who naively believed, or at least said, that divine justice would prevail without bloodshed, without the necessity of engaging in combat. Nonetheless, the presence of seasoned Landsknechten suggested operational competence at or beneath his leadership that was somehow, of course, seeking a solution, a negotiation, a peaceful settlement, preferably. In addition, the lower Allgäu Band, consisting of 7,000 men under the priest Florian Greisel, and the 5,000-strong Leibheim Band, posed a direct threat now to Ulm, that was the League's headquarters. Concerns grew thus for the League's forces, which risked encirclement by all these sizable peasant bands that could, like, they were not, as we've seen, particularly performing in a strictly qualitative sense, but with numbers could simply, sever Ulm's supply lines, could choke, like, properly the League's forces, that now really risked encirclement between Duke Ulrich's advancing troops and these newly emerged peasant bands. The Truxas attempted to stall hostilities by indicating that grievances would be addressed, which was an argument to buy time. Radicals in the Böblingen Band passed Ulrich Schmidt to advance their political agenda, though, culminating in the drafting of the so-called 12 articles outlining their social and religious grievances. This was also an attempt to confer the entire peasant revolt kind of homogeneous or at least coordinated effort, discipline, organization. In early March, leaders of the Lake and Allgäu bands convened in Memmingen to propose a united Christian brotherhood among, in fact, all the southern German peasants, establishing an articles of war for their collective forces. However, a key issue, the command structure, that is so crucial at every political and strategic level, remained unresolved, as each band retained independent leadership And so there were some efforts to try to keep contact between them, but it wasn't really like a common objective. First of all, from a political point of view, so you can imagine from a strategical one, and this, of course, heavily undermined the entire peasant revolt from the beginning, and there wasn't really much of a way the peasants could have fully coordinated their efforts in an effective way to begin with. Now, at Ulrich's retreat from Stuttgart, the Truxas turned his focus to suppressing the peasant rebellion with an army of 1,500 cavalry and 7,000 infantry, which was a really sizable force, considering also it was supported by 18 field guns. So basically, the Württemberg retreats, and he also with the bulk of his military cream, and so the peasants are at large left, without much of a protection. The Swabian League forces can advance into their territories. However, upon learning that the Truxas aimed to crush the peasants, at least some Landsknechten within the Swabian League mutinied, so showing like the pretty mixed. Remember, there were in imperial army Protestants, which is a political and ideological situation that happens all the time. And you can think in any country, in any military, regardless here of the political, historical times that can allow to define more or less better this post-Westphalian concept, like there is always like somebody in the file and ranks that does not agree with the general cause, but has some sort of necessity to at least be there. And so there is a very interesting entanglement in here, considered that at the sack of Rome that would have occurred in a few years, the Catholic Spaniards were apparently more ferocious than the Lutheran Landsknechten, that, by the way, were actually part of the imperial army themselves. So the paradox within the paradox. Nevertheless, this Landsknechten mutinies within the Swabian League armies were very serious, with contingents from Memmingen and Augsburg. So these are very sort of central places withdrawing, right? Despite these setbacks, the Truxas reached Ulm. However, local officials only allowed 600 cavalry to enter, so to essentially to support the entire. There were other 900 horsemen that could not receive adequate logistical support from the city. Reinforcements soon arrived from other league members, though, including forces from Bamberg, Mainz, Würzburg, Bavaria, and Hesse. We'll see now also these later Länder, what was happening there, because of course the peasant revolt was spreading there as well. Ulm, the Swabian theater, was recognized as the central one, and so these other German polities sent help. The League's council then ordered the Truxas to first target the Böblingen band, leading to skirmishes near Laubheim and Rislissen. On April the 2nd, the Böblingen peasants repositioned at Grünsheim, while the Truxas received orders to engage the Laubheim band. On April the 4th, 1525, the first major clash of the Peasants' War unfolded. The peasant force of 3,000 to 4,000 took an advantageous position near Laubheim, fortified with artillery and engaging in defensive tactics that we have seen similar, to what the Hussites would practice, wagon forts, with trying to obviously compensate for their lack of collective training, like combined arms effectiveness against, in fact, more professional forces in open field. The Truxas employed negotiations to maneuver his forces, so essentially buying time while some detachments were taking control of other areas around, maintaining the initiative, and still not coming to the major clash with the peasants. In fact, dispatching horsemen to disperse 1,200 distracted enemies, taking 250 peasants prisoners. Faced with all the full strength of the League now deployed, the peasants began to retreat, so they began to melt away. There were engagements, but it wasn't like a full clash. they didn't really have the capacity to stand their ground more than much. And so there is this rout, basically, this withdrawal turning into a rout with roughly 2,000 peasants escaping to Leipheim, while many drowned or were killed in pursuit. And this was a major victory for the Truxes, for the League. In fact, after the battle, the Swabian League army encamped outside Leipheim until April the 11th, facing, however, mutiny as troops demanded payment, which was yet the other huge issue. Again, made multiple videos on the topic because, as you know, in Renaissance warfare, it's such a leitmotif, right? The Truxes staved off dissent. However, Bauernjörg was a hell of an iron-fisted leader and marched off towards Lake Constance, this other hotbed of revolt. On April the 40th, you can follow it on a map, by the way. The places are enchanting, and just imagine that these were the teachers of some of the bloodiest chapters of early modern warfare. On April the 14th, the League confronted the Lower Allgäu Band at Würzach, where artillery overwhelmed the inexperienced peasant force, leading to their disbandment and capturing 4 cannon from their side. This really shows you, again, the amateurialism of the peasant forces, but also this interesting Renaissance, fire concentration from even limited artillery park, but still, to soften up the enemy lines and basically overwhelming them with later, the bulk of the forces attacking. The Lake Band continued, however, to capture castles and gain support, swelling their ranks to 12,000. This was a bit like the strength of the peasants' numbers. That's also why they died in such a large number. On April the 15th, both armies engaged at Weingarten. As the League's artillery opened fire, the Truxes prudently withdrew to a safer position. A ceasefire followed on Easter Sunday, during which the peasants repositioned their artillery for a potential counterattack. And this was interesting because at times the peasants didn't know how to use artillery. They had an effective counter to the enemy that often thought that these are just a bunch of, effective of animals. Like, they don't even know how to use artillery. In some cases, actually, they were successful, or at least they compelled the enemy to redraw their disposition, their deployment. The Truxes opted for negotiations instead of a frontal assault, influenced by the presence of experienced fighters among the peasants. In fact, the resulting Treaty of Weingarten, however, effectively neutralized the Upper Swabian peasants that couldn't basically go on more than much. This enabled, of course, less blood to be shed, and also the League to concentrate its efforts on suppressing disturbances in other areas, such as the Neckar Valley and Odenwald. And so this is also an interesting part. You can't quite track too easily, who was who there, what were the peasants that rose up. It was a massive movement. But at times, the same peasant forces realized they couldn't compete with more professional and organized forces, and so they desisted. An opportunity to unite with Duke Ulrich against the League was also missed, as Bulgenbach prepared his forces near Uffingen, focusing on threats to the Black Forest Band. Freiburg became a target for the Breisgau troop and other bands, as the Duke of Baden sought refuge there. By the way, it's interesting that on Schwerpunkt we talked about the Battle of Freiburg during the 30 Years' War. We talked about the Battle of Ulm, of course, in the War of the Third Coalition. So we're finally covering, enough of European warfare to sort of pass by the same places and learning a bit of geography further from it all. Now, on May the 17th, an encirclement by 18,000 peasants led to the city's surrender, Freiburg, right, talking, following intense negotiations. Subsequently, the Breisgau and Markgrave bands returned home. securing some concessions, while Bulgenbach's forces in the Black Forest, Hegau, and Klettgau continued their resistance until their eventual defeat in summer of 1525. So that's essentially how the Upper Swabian theater was. Well, speaking of Alsace, that, as you know, is just in the west. By the way, I, as you know, made multiple videos on all these various German historical provinces in my historical regional series. So if you want to arrive up to the to the threshold of the modern age for Swabia, Alsace, etc., all these other Länder, you can do it through that series. So by late April 1525, 5 well-organized bands mobilized in Alsace, particularly in the Sundgau, controlling several monasteries. Alsace is a land of monasteries. The Lower Alsace band, the most organized, was led by Erasmus Gerber, who established a rotation system for military service, 8 days on duty and 3 weeks at home. This is an interesting rota system that really was part of any kind of militia levy since ever. We've seen it often like in medieval armies organization. If anything, also for this obvious reason, it was very important for the peasants themselves and their strategic and logistical efforts, as peasants had to remain home, taking care of the harvest, and so helping to sustain this military effort, those who had gone to war, right? So they couldn't really move entirely, like they had to remain home, they had to protect their communities as well. In emergencies, all men were actually recalled, though, so showcasing tight organization among the peasant insurgents and sort of the most obvious necessity to fight all together in the most desperate situations, but it wasn't at least always the normality. On May the 12th, these peasants marched from Mauermünster and occupied Zabern, with numbers reaching approximately 18,000, making it the largest assembly in the Peasants' War. Think about that, because up to, again, something between 70 and 100,000 died, but we are not aware of more than 18,000 peasants having been reliably put together as an army, as a concentrated force. Everything was very scattered, right? And just even for them, like moving 18,000 troops at a time was such an enormous feat to pull off. In response, the Duke Anton of Lorraine mobilized an army consisting of 6,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry, which, by the way, tells you how still by the early modern age, even in a relatively sort of western land like Lorraine, cavalry was so central still, like how, of course, feudalism had not died, cavalry was still in the age of pike and shot, like still very performing, and actually outside of the major battlefields of Europe, still most local forces were actually very feudal and very conservative, very medieval, very cavalry based. Also, there were at least 12 cannons, which tells you, by the way, by distribution, by ratio with the rest of the troops, how expensive these were, right? In comparison, just as an arm to the others. And these troops were, by the way, quite mixed. They were mostly mercenaries from Spain, Germany, Flanders, Italy, and Albania. This is yet another underrepresented aspect of early modern warfare, the enormous degree of internationalization of the soldiery, right? How many different nations existed in this also relatively, say, provincial corners of Europe. Now, the Battle of Zabern commenced on May the 15th with heavy cannon fire from both sides. So the peasants are, again, responding with that. The Duke, surprised by the peasants' firepower, in fact, withdrew to fortified positions at St. Johann and Steinberg. Gerber assessed the battle's dynamics and requested reinforcements, but some arrived late, and the first column halted 6 kilometers away, while a second engagement at Lubstein, where fierce fighting ensued. The peasants initially retreated behind a wagon fort before being pushed back to the village. And this was really like the place of the major clash. You understand, as always, that whenever you need to entrench behind a wagon fort, you do not have the upper hand from a strategical point of view. And so the peasants retreat further to the village, in putting up like a strong defense. Like the Duke, as such, had limited options and ordered heavy cavalry to position handgunners close to the village for an assault. However, they encountered vigorous resistance, leading the Duke to burn the village down as a solution. Meanwhile, the peasants in Zabern watched the devastation unfold. When they sought to negotiate terms, the Duke demanded unconditional surrender and 100 hostages. So the were taken essentially by siege. And following the surrender, there was actually no mercy. The Duke's mercenaries attacked the defenseless peasants, causing panic. Many fled back to Saarbrücken, where they suffered severe casualties from the Duke's forces. And this defeat effectively ended the peasant uprising in Alsace. Duke Anton then attempted to return to Nancy, but encountered around 8,000 Middle Alsatian peasants at Scharweiler on May the 20th. This, however, was not a match for his forces. In fact, the encounter resulted in roughly 4,000 peasant casualties and 400 among the Landsknechten, which also put basically a nail on the coffin of this Alsatian uprising, and again showcased the regular superiority of much better organized and drilled feudal forces, mostly again spearheaded by mercenaries, as it was the kind at the time, and the fact that the peasants couldn't quite stand their ground against the professionals. Speaking of Württemberg, so we've seen how the Duke Ulrich had failed to, in his attempt to retake Stuttgart, that he thought to be his, thus exploiting the peasant revolt to his ends. We were in early 1525. So after that, Württemberg remained calm until news of unrest in Hegau and Upper Swabia spurred local peasants together. Commanded by Martin Feuerbacher at Bottwar and Hans Wunderer at Sabergau, along with Jäcklein, Rohrbach from Franconian, Thomas Meyer from the Black Forest, the peasant forces grew. Suspicion arose regarding Feuerbacher's moderate leadership, especially after radical Anton Eisenhut joined from Kraichgau, resulting in a combined force of about 12,000 men by late April. The Swabian League's army, under orders to march towards Württemberg, camped at Rottenburg from May the 2nd to the 4th. In anticipation, the peasant army attacked and captured Herrenberg on May the 10th. The League planned thus to retake the town, but the peasants set up 3 camps with artillery to defend. So again, they dug in once again. Under cover of darkness, the peasants also positioned themselves between Böblingen and Sindelfingen with a wagon fort on Galgenberg equipped with 18 artillery pieces. So this would be better. We will, if anything, make videos about the single battles as well. This is just a broader introduction, but of course this was a very strategic move, and especially the latter position was loaded with firepower to resist as long as possible. It's interesting how they knew the territory, how they would be able to move at night as well, to organize in this way. This naturally preludes to the major engagement at Böblingen. As we've seen, there are 12,000 peasants, not a few. It's one of the largest forces ever mobilized by them. And in this case, like, the Swabian League cavalry proved effective, routing the peasants and pursuing them for kilometers. They just basically run over them. I mean, they normal proceedings were also sending, I don't know, gunners, as we've seen, of Forlorn Hope, elite assault troops. But in this case, like, not even this desperate defensive position could withstand the might of men-at-arms, of cavalry. Again, remember this when you think about Wagenburgs and all this. I mean, I talked so much about this when discussing Hussite warfare that, in my opinion, is one of the single most overrated one ever. Not because the Hussites were not good in a broader moral or leadership sense, but because of the despicably technologistic and in part also populistic propaganda narrative that has been done in the popularization of that story, and it's also Protestant issue, and say crossing out of the picture instead of talking about the most important thing, that is to say that Bohemia went completely destroyed and lost its independence in the process, for centuries. No, it's just the genius of these guys using Wagenburg, like loads of peoples had always done from millennia, and just very well in some cases, but also in ways that are much more normal than the ones that have been sensationalized, especially by misreading things like the accounts of Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, that was also his enemies, and was sort of discrediting them, representing this wagon tactics as some sort of snakes. People thinking that was their actual art of war, like that could have worked just in countries like Bohemia. And you see that even like this other notion that in the Renaissance infantry was everywhere, was defeating all no, right? And generally speaking, that there is also this notion that it's a bit forgotten, that is, there are areas where in order to have fully fledged pike and shot warfare, you must be a hell of a power, right? And just a few countries and politics can do this. We talked about the Habsburgs, General the Landsknechten were part of this, but you see here even the difficulty of putting them together, like from the other side of Germany. We talked about the Tercio recently, we talked about the French, but if you look at these local realities, still, right, you can't even have such an effectively, like, sort of larger scale pike and shot warfare as in the bigger battlefields of Europe, simply because you need, first of all, lots of pikemen in order for them to be effective, and cavalry is still there to punch and crush on a regular basis. And the Battle of Böblingen is actually one of the best examples, especially considering that they simply ran over the peasant wagon force. And so highlighting it, of course, warfare is always and primarily a matter of moral forces, and if you're not good at it, if you're not strong enough, you can use whatever technical mean, you will fail. By the way, the victory of the Swabian League allowed the Truxas to proceed to suppress uprisings in Franconia and the Odenwald, that we will see now, in retaliation for the execution of the Duke of Helfenstein. By the way, the Truxas exacted brutal punishment on captured leaders, which is exactly what they deserved, including Melchior Nonnenmacher and Jeklein Horbach, by burning them alive, right? So also, if you have complaints about people being burned alive in the past, first of all, ask yourself why they were burned alive, including, yes, for witchcraft at Similia, or by the Inquisition, etc. And look at what other people did all around, and then, try to make some assessment there. We'll talk about this. It's an incredibly important topic. But you really must give the example here. This is not just about taking out some rebel forces from a map, like in video games. This is about violently and traumatically resubject these peasants into subservience, given the natural order of society and tradition and hierarchy and power and beauty and intelligence and force. But passing to the Franconian landscape, the sort of lesser theaters are not actually less brutal. On the contrary, but they're also sort of less movemented, we can say, relatively so. So by mid-March 1525, the unrest we've witnessed in Swabia had also spilled over into Franconia, particularly in the Tauber Valley, Odenwald, and along the river Neckar. Rothenburg and its surrounding villages formed the epicenter of this uprising, aided by the existing local militia known as the Rothenburger Landwehr. Right? There are some consonances also with later sort of persistent German military organization. So, of course, it was a very strong popular component. On March the 22nd, a Franconian company of 800 peasants was mustered under village heads Neuther and Georg Ickelsheimer, soon to be joined by a smaller group led by Leonard Metzler and Hans Boheim, which formed the Tauber Valley Band. This mobilization led to gradual factions in Rothenburg contributing to a growing force, eventually numbering around 4,000 men. As you understand, it's not just like an overwhelming, military history, such an explosion of power, but altogether like the extent across Germany. This is what I would like to leave you with. And the general desperation of these forces that perfectly knew that we're fighting against the odds, really, but understanding they're behind these actions, the peasants' motivations at a bit of a deeper level. As you understand here, there was a lot of anti-traditional push from their side, but also you must understand the actual limit conditions which they actually lived, right? Which went in parallel, right? Didn't make their cause better, but it at least motivated it in the sense of making themselves killed, and you can't understand that until you understand their desperation in that regard. So these are very instructive chapters in Renaissance politics and history and warfare in general. There you have also the famous Florian Geyer that was, as you know, a bit romanticized and later because of socialistic, nationalistic movements of the age of mass society, fourth state in power, so that I made a video about the Freikorps that, in a sense, tells you a bit about that in a very different context, but still, interestingly, looking at these sort of different times and sort of misappropriating them to a degree. Florian Geyer was an experienced excommunicated knight, which already tells you like why. Of course, he's brutally fascinating in many ways. He had leading military and diplomatic expertise, by the way. So these are also the kind of men that you can find at the head of peasants. You know that I specialize in early 14th century warfare, and so exactly that span of a few generations in which you have a series of essentially either bourgeois or peasant victories, rustics or communes, like across at least an important part of Europe. We talk also about the Dithmarscher for German peasant warfare that stretched from more or less those times to even these ones, like of the Renaissance. If you're interested, I will surely insert it in the recommended videos down below. And the point I was making being, yes, that this is very dear to me because I care very much about the ultimate effectiveness of army systems, the art of war, and how they compare to one another. Of course, though, these armies are not going to go anywhere, right? This notion that early 14th century infantry-only victories were paving the way to mid-15th century pike squares is completely nonsensical, right? From at least in a deeper, say, more absconded sense, yes, you can say that infantry had the potential to revive whatever, but it's not what really happened in a consequential way from any political, military, social standpoint. We're talking about very different communities doing very different things. The early 14th century exploits were just also acts of desperation. The one from the Renaissance were now proletarian forces, fielded, trained, armed by the most powerful princes of Europe, right? Because otherwise they would have gone nowhere, because they didn't really have any power in that sense. In the early 14th century, these infantries do not simply win alone. There's this, again, pseudo, romanticistic, socialistic obsession, nonsense for popular force and whatever, that was present. But first of all, notice that these are large bodies of infantrymen, so it's not even that there is much of an individual force, it's just mostly some cohesive compaction and desperation at times. But very importantly, these armies are all ordered, trained, instructed, and commanded by noblemen. It's not like an army of peasants during the Middle Ages rising against a particular prince is not ruled by noblemen, right? It's always the case. We've seen it also for the Dittmarscher. Think about the Dampierre during the Franco-Flemish War. Thinking about, the Scottish armies against the Edwards of England. Think about the same Swiss in many ways. Like there was always a knight telling how to line up, telling what to pick, like where to deploy. This is basically the same thing. We've seen the Landsknechten also among the peasantry and sort of ranks, and these were the finest forces, by the way, at their disposal. And so these armies are not overwhelmingly different from others in terms of actual technicalities, as we've seen, but they're differently stratified, right? We have seen many times how late medieval and early modern armies are basically spearheaded by what we call mercenaries. So this professional soldiery that has increasingly appeared, especially on foot in this period, different from, the High Middle Ages, where the elite was really the cavalrymen, and then the footmen were just auxiliaries of some sort, regardless of their greater or smaller military effectiveness. And then you have some bit of, at least when royalty or very strong princely powers are involved, there is this household troops, some sort of like permanent forces, a small nucleus, and then you have these levies that form like mostly just the reserves, the posterior ranks or something, right? So here it's quite similar, because you would have men-at-arms in charge like Florian Gaia and Landsknechten, and it were, as we've seen, differently mixed with the rest of society. And then mostly this peasant rabble that was not good for much. It really did lack any training, most of the equipment. But they were angry enough. And of course, the peasant revolt was so disastrous for the peasants, but it's not like they rose without any actual kind of chance of winning or doing something about their condition. So never underestimate in warfare how much, again, moral forces in the actual measure in which you want to rip off the intestines of the person in front of you alive, which is actually, let's be honest, is much more important than anything, like than weapons, than anything. Of course, warfare is much more about moral forces and the capacity of seeing those actual forces in employing them, in commanding them, in spiriting them, in organizing. But it's not about the eternal illusion of deterministic technologism and materialism dictating the outcome of warfare. That's just what lesser people and the mentally feeble in general must believe, because they, of course, are paranoidly entrenching into this complete rejection of any kind of human worth that they are perfectly aware of being dramatically short of. So to give this chicken brain explanation. Going back on the Franconian bands, here like the one of the Tauber Valley, on April the 24th, this host sets camp at Ochsenfurt, establishing articles of war. So in their case, with all the same objective, structuring military ranks and organization, trying to homogenize as possible like this kind of hierarchy and order, which is also interesting because, of course, all the utopistic ideas of equality, of egalitarianism, of communism, or any other source also against authority or spirituality, of difference of worth of the works, etc., is thrown out of the window in which you have to make an army work. That you can't have an ideology, rooting for those things and then having to wage a war. That's not how it works. You have to go completely in the other direction. Now, these articles we just mentioned were crucial as they compelled essentially the local nobility of Franconia to surrender their artillery in exchange for property protection. Very interesting blackmail. Remember, the world was ruled by the mob, right? So this is normally what the nobility did. Now the peasants were doing so in the same identical way, and it actually worsened more brutally. And this resulted in peasant bands obtaining ordnance from dukes like Albrecht and Georg von Hohenlohe. Meanwhile, peasants from the Odenwald rallied under Georg Metzler, adopting the famous Bundschuh symbol, right, literally with the shoe. That this had already been used in previous revolts, because these were, we said it last time, not the first German revolts of the early 16th century. They're routinely happening every once in a while. We rightfully do not remember them on history manuals because just a bunch of peasants rebelling and being massacred. But this thing of the Bundschuh, the League of the Shoe, symbolizing this most humble peasantry background, was of course a symbol of the era of this broader movement. And under this, the peasants attacked the Cistercian monastery at Schöntal. Obviously, again, the Protestant fervor against ecclesiastical institutions, their wealth, etc. They were targeting it, obviously enough, as raiders. And this force combined with the Neckar Valley peasants under Jacqueline Rohrbach, we mentioned before, for Swabia, forming a feared contingent known as the Hellerhaufen. Remember that Haufen is like they're the companies, more or less. Again, also the peasant armies. We've seen it in the other video. Follow the most common pattern of having company-sized forces, being put together in these detachments, mostly that have mirror sort of regimental force, even though they tend to stick together. And so, if anything, these regiments are normally the historical battle lines. We've seen it split in three, which partly gives also the names certain formations they adopted. Again, more the strategical consideration in the aforementioned video. In any case, Hellerhaufen stands for the brighter, the lighter companies, right? And with a strategic focus, the Hellerhaufen targeted Weinsberg, the seat of the Duke Ludwig of Helfenstein, whose forces were unprepared for a castle assault. And the peasants succeeded, in fact, in capturing the Duke himself, but the brutality of their treatment of him, forcing him to run a gauntlet of pikes, would have dire repercussions. Remember always that the peasants are the single most ruthlessly violent element of any population. Right? The fourth estate, the lesser people, are always the single most animal-like force that agitates without any reason or capacity. Also, the Clausewitzian Trinity acknowledges this. Lesser people believe that politics are the bad guys, right? And obviously it's always the same populistic, paranoid, hysterical life threat they perceive at any kind of value of power and authority. But the actual brutality, like the primordial hatred, as you know in the Clausewitzian Trinity, is connected exactly with the people, right? That is needed. Von Clausewitz tells us, we'll have to come back on the Clausewitzian Trinity, that you can't have war without all the three elements. But politics is reason. The military is the gamble part, like the game part that the military loves to play. So completely different from all the notions of the warriors, for example, that this other populistic BS that lesser people buy into just because they parrot other people without having any trace of any remotely identifiable strategic education, culture, or whatever. But this is unfortunately for them, because they always sink in that sense without other people sort of elevating them in history, like in this picture. Now, tensions arose as peasant commanders, particularly Wendel Hippler and Georg Metzler, repudiated Rohrbach's methods and replaced him with the expert but controversial Götz von Berlichingen, whose past raised concerns among the ranks. In fact, this was a veteran of Maximilian I. He was a knight, was a nobleman, so not exactly like a peasant, supporter by social extraction. In fact, different issues would arise from this. But as we've seen, there were men-at-arms, of course, siding with leaders. And there is also this contrast between ideologism, especially of this peasant uprisings loaded with, in fact, these utopistic ideas of how the world should be run, how now everything was changing. But again, in practice, you have, first of all, to fight for it. And if you can't fight, if you don't have experienced commanders, you don't really get anywhere. And we're talking commanders, because also final rank soldiers alone, by definition, are not officers, are not commanders. They do not really know. They're not really designed to think what's above. That's yet another issue in the populistic view of the military that, unfortunately, the average person, unsurprisingly so, believes. In any case, by late April, the band, the Taube, the Ellerhaufen, advanced to Amorbach, where radical Odenwald peasants voiced intentions to burn the castle of Wildenburg, contradicting the moderate articles of war previously established that sought this kind of moderation. The Wildhausen band also mobilized, recognizing the existing order while seeking to negotiate grievances with authorities that, remember, was always the same like objective at large, like just winning a better exploitation regime for the peasantry, right, in relation to their lords. This force numbered about 7,000. And this group remained comparatively passive, just given their ultimate intentions. They were not so radical as we've seen. In fact, the military actions would be primarily restricted to the Aura contingents. In response to the growing unrest, the Bishop Conrad III of Würzburg sought help from the nobility, but received scant support, compelling him to negotiate with peasants. This is interesting because it highlights some issues that we have encountered always in German history and that were now exacerbated by the Reformation. That is to say, of course, that the lay nobility wanted to take advantage of the dissolution of the ecclesiastical properties, because, of course, they knew that the peasants would have not gone anywhere with that. And so if they could do it for them, the nobility would have eventually taken over the system and, in this case, probably cashed some bishops' lands, right? And, the alienation, the confiscation of ecclesiastical goods during the Reformation. And this is an interesting, especially in an area like Franconia. It starts again, as you know, mostly Protestantism in Germany spreads in the northern, the least developed part. Nevertheless, after securing promises and funds from Duke William of Henneberg to raise an army, the situation deteriorated as the Wildhausen band established a roadblock. Germany is now well sort of cleared, deforested, reclaimed, but there are just so many like passages. Some forests are still very important. They do create some geographical boundaries, and there aren't so many routes of communications in Central Europe. On May the 8th, the peasants thus advanced into Würzburg, a major center, of course, in Franconia, besieging the Frauenberg castle and utilizing 6 heavy cannons, culverins, and falconets to bombard it. They're a few, but they're big. So despite the initial bombardments, however, the castle's fortifications held firm. Yet another proof that, of course, artillery couldn't simply do miracles. I made lots of videos about the actual staticization of siege warfare during the 16th and the 17th century. And these were also sort of more old-style castles in many ways, not like the sort of most updated Traces Italiennes. In any case, after 2 failed assaults and escalating supply problems, peasant leaders attempted negotiations once more, but were met with resistance. As the imperial army approached, Berlichingen was forced to order a retreat from Würzburg. Right? And by May the 28th, the Truxas entered Franconia himself, bolstering his forces, which totaled 13,000 troops and 42 pieces of artillery, which is hell of a punching power there, following a crushing victory at Neckarsulm, where the Hellerhaufen, the Bright Band, retreated after calling for reinforcements facing substantial losses. This led to further flight to Königshofen, where they suffered defeat at the hands of the Swabian League army. The Tauber Valley band attempted to regroup near Ingolstadt, but encountered disaster at Sulzdorf, leading to a brutal confrontation where Gaia narrowly escaped with a small contingent. Ultimately, on June the 8th, the Truxas entered Würzburg, advancing towards Nuremberg, marking a turning point against the peasant movements. Meanwhile, scattered peasant forces faced a renewed offensive, particularly in the Allgäu, where they laid siege to Memmingen. I've seen it before, and the Truxas was ordered to address this threat with additional troops. And so there was a series of clashes, and the Allgäu peasants unexpectedly abandoned their positions and artillery, leading to their final defeat. And so the remaining insurgents either surrendered or were executed as the League reasserted control, also exemplifying the violent suppression of the peasant uprising across the region. Again, the suppression was really tremendous and infamous, given just, again, what the general, you have to enter in the mental sort of structures of the time. Like, these are truly lesser people. I mean, let's stress it, especially in Central Europe. Like, the peasantry is just zero, right? They are animals. They are like Saint Luther, right? And if Luther says that, that these are actual rabid dogs to be put down, that there is something there that must be also understood. Let's put it in this way. But let's talk of even a more, say, a wilder land like Thuringia. Now, my Thuringian followers will want to stab me as a consequence. But I made multiple videos about Thuringia. We'll keep doing it. It's beautiful land. Again, if you have to visit, one of the reasons why I make all these videos about the regional historical series is because I just love Europe and had luck of traveling so much across all of it, almost all of it. And it's impossible not to love all these places and to understand how deeply intertwined they were throughout this time. So in Thuringia, uprisings emerged later than in Swabia and Franconia, but were quelled earlier. Two bands from Allstadt and Mühlhausen formed this recurrent term, like the eternal alliance with God, under Heinrich Pfeiffer and Thomas Münzer, mustering under the famous rainbow banner that you have surely seen. And any connection here is purely, coincidental. Just think about the ideological background that, as I'm trying to, making you see in a traditional sense. Rainbows are beautiful, but not really in the way they're normally used in our times. Not even at the time, even. But it's interesting as a symbol in general. And so these are sort of the most famous leaders of, like, Münzer especially. And they gained support within a 10-mile radius, extending their influence into Franconian Saxony, especially the latter, as is very, blurred in the southern part with Thuringia, because historically Saxons sort of Germanized the latter from the north. Another group is the Werra band, taking the name here from the various valleys, led by Hans Zippel, aiming to expand the revolution into Hesse. Münzer strategized to take Mansfeld and march through Thuringia to Halle and Eisenach, while the Mühlhausen band engaged the Saxon princes. By early April, the Landgrave Philip of Hesse focused on the southern uprisings but turned to Thuringia on the 23rd, realizing the threat to his domain. By the way, this figure is very famous. If you know about the Board of League of Schmalkald, we will have to talk about him. He had a major pivotal role in Charles V's Germany. Philip quickly recruited 250 horse and 1,500 foot, targeting the Beasant Band, but identified Münzer as the primary challenge, as an ideologue, as the spiritual leader. Philip sold 6,000 foot, 6,000 heavy horse, 15,000 artillery pieces, and support engineers to strengthen his army. And this is a hell of a force, especially in Thuringia. Showing also how sort of emergential the thing appeared there. At the start of May, the Duke Georg of Saxony struggled to assemble forces in Leipzig, resorting to hiring mercenaries to muster around 800 horse and 1,000 foot. And these are some of the most backward and feudal parts of Germany. They are witnessing actually an important development. I don't think about Württemberg, also the Lutheran connection there, but in general, like we've seen it also in the videos about the 30 Years' War armies organization, like this, the northeastern German armies were very backward in so many ways, reflecting these intrinsic limits locally in terms of resources and more. Georg linked up with other princes at Heldrungen and advanced towards Frankenhausen. We are on May the 15th, bringing together an army of approximately 2,300 armored horse, remember again the centrality of cavalry, and over 4,000 foot against 8,000 peasants. The cavalry infantry ratio here is really cool because it's as if we were still in the Middle Ages. I mean, this immediately recalls me of my favorite times, my research, and again, you see, it's basically the same thing. 2,300 men-at-arms on horseback, like with just 4,000 accompanying infantry, just typically medieval. And so remember how the art of war how gradually the art of war innovations are actually spreading in early medieval, early modern Europe, and how sort of big the differences between various parts of Europe actually are, even within the same Germany, especially also like between the north and the south, as we know. This was a thing since medieval times and before. On May the 14th, a Hessian contingent faced fierce fire from peasants, leading to a retreat. And surprise for Philip, the Landgrave, who expected the peasants to flee. This is interesting as well. These guys were mastering the back and shot warfare, at least by that scale of engagement. The peasants repositioned on an elevation known as the Hausberg and disrupted movements with artillery fire as well. While some peasant officers saw to negotiations, they found Philip unyielding, demanding the surrender of their leaders. It's really typical when you look at these engagements, like we mostly think of battles, warfare in general, like, I don't know, two guys just wanted to kill each other no matter what, but again, going back in my memories of early 14th century warfare, you do find the situations in which you think that, in this case, oh, look, infantry is strong, it's taking on, at least it's defended mostly, because that's the truth, against cavalry, but still doing so in, not even in full open field, normally behind some ditch or something. And like, these guys want to negotiate as well. They want to find a solution to this broader struggle. It's how you want just to settle issues in life. Again, politics dominates here, as always. The military is just, as we've seen, it's instrument with other means, Clausewitzianly speaking. So that even if these peasants have, just imagine even the pride and the galvanization in front of, having stopped the Landgrave forces by shooting at them, by, showing them that you can't stand your ground. There is a sense that, of course, like, especially now considering how many troops Philip has brought with him, that there is not much to do. Münzer, however, interpreted the sudden appearance of a rainbow in the sky as a sign of victory, given their rainbow standard, which tells you also how dangerous radicals and ideologues are. So what happens, and this is very poignant, also strictly Catholically rewarding terms, that Philip seized the opportunity exactly when Münzer's sermon distracted the peasants. And so with the Saxon and Allied forces finally coordinated, Philip ordered an advance, breaching the wagon fort under artillery fire and pressing into Frankenhausen. A significant massacre ensued with over 5,000 peasants killed and 300 prisoners executed. That's what happens when you play with fire. And yet another splendid demonstration that, especially as soon as there is enough concentrated artillery fire against, for example, wagon forts, something that didn't normally happen against the Hussites in wilder lands than these, wagon forts are just done. The Hussites could have not succeeded, I don't know, in the plains of France or of Italy. We're talking different areas, right? And even in Thuringia, you have this. Here, this again, not just about the wagons or the artillery, but in general, right? For all those who root for, oh my God, wagon fort's so cool, like the peasants are going to, no, they're going to be butchered like animals, right? And that's what happens when you're just not capable to begin with, or your enemies are also better than you, also from a spiritual, religious point of view. Now, days later, the princes convened at Schlotheim to plan an assault on Mühlhausen, which surrendered on May the 25th. Münzer and Pfeiffer were captured and executed, solidifying the princes' brutal responses. Again, in Germany, there wasn't much, heartfelt human tenderness or mercy towards peasants in general, historically, in the history of the country. The repressions were as shocking as you can imagine. So here we're not making just the case that it was good to exterminate them, but they should have thought better as well. So by the summer of 1525, the German Peasants' Revolt was effectively crushed in southern, at least in southwestern central Germany, leaving only isolated pockets of resistance in what is now Austria, so more or less southeastern Germany. Which is also interesting because, of course, these were the Habsburgic Erbländer. So the peasant revolt in this region equated to a much more embarrassing distraction for the Habsburgs, for anybody witnessing like the center imperial might was frustrated by these issues. And telling you the truth, this is not much just like Lower Austria, right? We're mostly talking about the fringe areas of the country, the Alpine areas specifically. And so briefly, because there were also, as a consequence, less important clashes. If anything, just they are from a political and symbolical point of view. In the spring of 1525, peasants and miners in Salzburg revolted. As you know, Salzburg was historically one of the most important ecclesiastical principalities in Germany. It held like the primacy in Germany. It had this significant wealth due to its position, like the historical, in fact, mining and the surrounding mountains, the proximity of the Danube reached through the waterways. During the Middle Ages, that this was in fact the center where salt, hence the name of the town, was exported up to Constantinople, along the Danube to the Black Sea, and then the Straits. So this is powerful and important, and especially during the time of Reformation, such an important Catholic center in the deepest, most intimate, history of Europe from such a long time, was an even more punching location for the peasants to strike. So this peasants and miners revolt, and they basically seize the city and besiege the fortress of Hohensalzburg, that, as you know, is a very difficult target, let's put it in this way. Concerned about the spread of unrest into the Tyrol, Archduke Ferdinand ordered nobles in Steiermark and Kärnten to raise a force of 5,000 mercenaries from Magyar, Bohemian, and German communities, commanded by Sigmund von Dietrichstein. I made a video about medieval Styria. I have another one incoming on medieval Carinthia. So if you're interested in these lands, also just stick around. So you understand here the Habsburgs have at least the money. They can, they don't have to mobilize an immense amount of forces, but the location is quite delicate, and they have access also to this more eastern world, like from Hungary, from Bohemia. We've seen these lands in the series about the Habsburgs exactly at this point, what they were about, how they were connected with the Habsburgic domains. They weren't very, very, very strongly glued together, right? But at this time, at least, the Habsburgs were enjoying a great power, right? The first half of the 16th century is very rewarding. At least it was actually very frustrating, but still it was the peak of the Habsburgic power during the century. So on July the 2nd, the insurgents, led by Michael Gruber, ambushed Dietrichstein's forces near Schladming, overpowering his artillery and cavalry. Interestingly enough, marking a pivotal peasant victory. It's sort of strange that actually the most successful peasant victory was essentially in an area like the ones sort of more directly under the Habsburgic control. And the Salzburg contingent in Gruber's army returned to continue, by the way, the siege on Hohensalzburg that had been going on in the meanwhile. This is also yet another typical strategic reality, as you know, triggers major confrontations, again, siege warfare, like an army besieges a center, and it's doing it either to lure the enemy or to seize the place, and, the guy comes to relieve, to break the siege, relieving the center, and the besiegers go to open warfare. And this is very interesting at large, again, as an outcome. Following Schladming, Ferdinand was forced to make concessions during the Innsbruck Assembly. So this had messed up the whole situation, because now some concessions had to be made for these peasants that in fact are not satisfied at all, right? The southern peasants rejected the Habsburgic offer. So it's heavy, it's powerful, it's very... Again, now the Imperials had won at Pavia, so in many ways, who cares about these peasants in Salzburg? But at large, it was not a good impression, in general. In August, so the thing drags on. Ferdinand dispatched 10,000 Landsknechten under Georg von Frundsberg to Salzburg, and that's sort of the problem solution. Of course, Frundsberg, he was sort of in many ways the father of the Landsknechten, together with Maximilian. The first we've seen that were these veterans all around. Before we've seen Götz von Berlichingen in Thuringia. This was a guy with an iron prosthesis for the entire arm, right? And going at war like that. These were the kind of bad blips of, the early modern warfare. Especially the Germans maintained this sense of, again, almost autarkic individualistic warriorism, even as single men at arms. This, as we've seen, informed also the same Landsknechten mentality in many ways. However, these were, of course, a broader troop, now trained to act in that broader collective fashion, and this is why now, under the best general, they're sent against the rebels. Also because, as we've seen, the I mean, the Germans are in part done in Italy, with the French king captured. And so this troops dispatchment is sufficient for a truce to be established in September. However, when the princes violated the agreement, the clashes reignited, showing how sort of well entrenched the peasants really were in Salzburg. In 1526, the thing dragged really on. We'll see now that the heads of this revolt are not caught for years. Michael Geismar became the leader of the mobilized peasants, a coalition consisting of Austrian, Bavarian, and Swabian troops that now are also more liberated by the end, of course, of the broader peasant revolt, along with Salzburg mercenaries, pursued Geismar unsuccessfully during the early summer, by the way, suffering defeats at Golling, Kitzbühel, Kirchberg, and Meuterdorf. Eventually, he was cornered at Radstadt, leading to his retreat across the Alps, where, into Venetian territory. You know that the Venetians had this pretty awkward position of being essentially not Holy Roman Imperial subjects, but since mostly the 15th century, having created this, consistent terra firma dominion. In fact, in northeastern Italy, that is imperial territory. And the Venetians at large have issues with the Habsburgs all the time, all across the Alps. We'll talk more about Venetian warfare with the Habsburgs in the early 16th century. And so the Serenissima hosts Geismar, that is this sort of interesting political pawn refugee. And not only the Venetian territory that is wide and fortified and sort of compact would serve as a base for further incursions across the Alps into Germany. So Geismar is kind of a pain behind for the Habsburgs for such a long time, and a veritable threat to the Archduke Ferdinand until his final assassination in Padua in 1532. And again, in Renaissance Italy, life is not very long, especially if you are if you have an international reputation, and so many powerful people want you dead. And so that's also a nice story, which also concludes, ideally, even though it was over from several years, the Peasants' War. Like the death of Geismar is the final chapter, final tragedy of this clash that lasted essentially a couple of years, resulting in, again, something between 70 to 100,000 casualties among not just the peasants, but also other people, commoners, and etc., mostly. The consequences, the aftermath, really are big, because essentially the failure of the peasants' revolt brings to the full plunging of Germany into the most feudal, princely establishment order that would last essentially until the 19th century. That is, just keeping this society fundamentally blocked in part, but just with this very exploited and subjugated peasantry that really do not have any better chance to do much in the rest. This is a very repressive moment. We have seen how essentially, places like England, Germany, if you look at the broader expansion, for example, of medieval civilization, that they always arrived later, right, compared to countries like France or Italy, because they were sort of newer countries, and in this sense they actually grew more in relative terms to these other giants that were bigger in absolute terms. Germany is very big, but it's also, in fact, it's as big as Italy, and it's at this point actually also the equally advanced technologically wise. But it's completely different in terms of local, political and social organization. It's a veritably feudal country, and also a very largely agricultural one. And the the sense is that the German Peasants' Revolt can be interpreted as the tail strike of the great late medieval revolts. So the ones that would start, again, in other countries earlier, like in France with the Jacquerie, mid-14th century, same time, the textile workers of the major Italian and Flemish cities. Then you have the Hussites, you have the English, the Hussites in the first half of the 15th century, the English peasant revolt, so what Tyler's John Bolt at the end of the 14th. And Germany has this. There were other rebellions all around, but overall, like this, the German Peasants' Revolt is brief but intense. It's a massive wave, and it's so radically repressed that basically plunges Germany again back into this firm princely reality. I made last year 3 videos lasting 2 hours each, explaining what princely Germany actually is, how this system worked, like from properly the imperial down to the royal, regional, provincial realities, the diet, why this country had an elective monarchy, why there was this level of decentralization, sort of federal mentality already from a while. And so you can argue that many things in Germany actually continue from the Middle Ages in an interrupted way, almost fairy tale like, also as far as the darkest aspects of the same. Throughout this century, the German Peasants' Revolt is this massive chapter in history, and it's sort of very unique in its intensity. I would say it's the biggest revolution since the French one. By numbers at least, and it's also so short and so apparently devoid of any chance or at least broader coordination or capacity, etc. So the populace following this insurrection was reasserted under the political control of their aristocratic and ecclesiastical masters that had always been ruling over this largely, again, simply possessed people of some sort, even if they were freemen on paper, like they were de facto serfs in life. And in retaliation, by the way, we said it, the overlords' mercenaries ravaged the countryside with even greater brutality than the peasant factions had, but also with much greater logic to an extent, because also they wouldn't simply destroy their own places. They needed these people as a labor force, and permanent contributions and levies were imposed on villages and smaller towns. Right after this wave, at least this was a bigger, like it would have been better if had it not happened, also for the nobility, because they lost so many people, because you couldn't even simply let this go, right? You had to put an end to the matter. So lots of people were massacred as a consequence. They had died in combat, in the general displacement. Think about the distractions at large. So much had been lost because of the peasants to begin with, and then there is this repression, and as a consequence, local communities are ever more subjected, right, to nobility rule. So enforcing a state of serfdom that would endure until the 18th century, practically. And so meanwhile, the efforts towards separating religious and secular powers, as well as gradual emergence of representative governments that unfolded in Britain, were largely unabateable to the German-speaking regions. This is a point that I made countless times, especially when you hear, because they invest the ignorance in this, invests practically the entire sort of popular Anglo-Saxon interpretation of Germany as a sort of peer of a country that evolved in similar ways, or was at least sharing some fundamental principles of absolute, advancement or capacity compared to, say, Britain or France. It was a completely different world, and throughout most of the centuries, much behind. But incomparably so. This is true, again, since the 13th century. It's the 13th, 14th century. There is no doubt that there is a completely different mentality. There is a completely different social landscape. There is a completely different culture, a completely different political background. And this heavily informed Germany, that already was in the fundamentals like this before, right? since really the migration era. You can't argue otherwise, and in general, it's not like that before it was ever better, but in a sense, like the affirmation of an elite and an oligarchy that does not really leave any space for any other local autonomy, if not by accident, by personal shortcoming, rather than like a sort of rational, enlightened view, is just like also part of what Germany is. Again, very advanced in many ways. There is no comparison. Like, for example, the rest of Central Europe is not as developed as Germany. Germany is by far the most advanced land in Central Europe. But be extremely clear in a cultural sense, this is not Western Europe. And the sooner you understand this, the easier your understanding of European and world history will be, right? Because romanticizations really bring you nowhere, if not in understanding, again, a world that is paradoxically the opposite of what you think actually the traditional world is at least, if you want the actual traditional side of the story, not the populistic, idiotic one that you hear today. In fact, that's why I also insist very much on the ultimate failure of the peasants here, also in the background of the Protestant instances, etc. Like, be clear, right? History does not depend on your personal, subjective, fantasistic preferences. It is very strongly rooted into pretty macroscopically objective and sort of self-evident historical realities, right? And you cannot dodge them, all right? It just does not work. You must be extremely consistent with historical analysis and general personal culture, education. These are not found mysteriously somewhere on the internet. They require decades of work, and very often that is not even just per se enough, right, to give any solidity to it. But it's not like we don't know what it looks like. For the rest, from a strictly military point of view, of course, we have mostly highlighted, if anything, the practice of the campaigns, the dynamics that we illustrated in the previous video. In many ways, these peasants were very poorly qualitative compared to the sort of average German forces that could be mobilized by the establishment. And to say, in this video, we didn't insist too much on the violence, nor from one side nor from the other, at least compared to the one that it actually was, right? And so we're talking about unspeakable chapters. But realize what this thing was at the time and reflect on the general context, especially the connection with Italian wars. Again, it's not a surprise that the peasant uprising broke out in a moment in which the imperial army was busy in another country, so it could not simply intervene or be deployed locally, which tells you even you can't really treat it as a mathematical equation, but this is also beyond any other historical contingency. I mean, those forces were present normally in Germany, and so they were extremely useful for keeping like the German this peasantry in this case, but also other groups under, in ways that you can't quite ignore at large, like in just in terms of local authority, level of societal control. That's the degree I was talking about of actually pretty scarce grip in Central Europe from the side of constituted order, and not for the better of not meaning that. Say, I'm talking of a bigger state, like the local princes acted, as we've seen, as mobsters, and again, the peasants had much less autonomy, liberty than in the West. So the notion that civilization would be useless, that people are better off ruling themselves by themselves, this is what happens when they rule themselves by themselves. And I'm not just talking the peasants here, I'm talking about the middle level sort of lord, restored. The fact this is still an oligarchic system, that people alone largely do not have the palest idea of what to do with themselves. We see it on a regular basis on social media. It's a complete waste of time, most people's existence. and energies. Like, lots of problems could frankly be avoided. Now the problem is that there is a breaking point at some point, so that existence is deliberately called into practical questioning, and you see what happened to the German peasants of the early 16th century. I'm very glad, however, that we are talking more about 16th century warfare. I actually started doing this a bit more frequently from last year, for the simple reason that Schwerpunkt's objective has always been to be extremely proper and to cover, say, in covering the entirety of the art of war. I actually like very much, I would have probably specialized in the 17th century. Hadn't I been an antiquist or a medievalist, I would have definitely liked especially that period, but also the 16th century. So it's so fascinating. In many ways it's frustrating as well, because you realize, especially in this case, what kind of mess this really was. At least the 17th century was also frustrating, but at least more movemented, more consequential than this. And in general, I see that we have here 80 videos about this is 16th century which is a lot, honestly. I didn't think. It's almost reaching our Byzantine history content, which I didn't really think, because I never really saw Schwerpunkt before this greater insistence on modern warfare, especially as a modern warfare sort of based channel. But here I see 16th century 76 videos. Like, in my mind, it's as if I had done so few, like a few tens, and instead we are already there. Again, it's not fully considered. Most of this is just a general approach to different topics. There's so much to cover, because also the 16th century is a lot of history, but I mean a lot of history. However, overall, considering that step by step we really arrived there in a way or another, I'm fairly satisfied. I can't say this is such a bad result, and I hope we can go ever more in depth as we look at this. In general, I think that we can be relatively satisfied. And I'm also glad in general we discussed specifically 16th century German Peasants War, because it's a bit defiled. As a bit like 16th century German warfare in general, I think it could be, I mean, if we talk about Landsknecht, it's something, but it's mostly about warfare elsewhere, right? But properly German warfare is a bit underappreciated, also because there was a lot of it, frankly, right? Other areas had their moments. Like, for example, the Italian wars were this succession of, at least until they shifted towards the Netherlands, they were repetitive, but they were also relatively contained. Like, there was a broader point, forces were more vehiculated. There were terrible times and disastrous ones, to say the least. But at a certain point, they stopped. And especially with the Spanish hegemony, Italy reaches a level of general peaceful and general order. Right? There is a more harmonious development. There is a massive, continuous sort of issue in territorial control or political destabilization. Germany is really much more difficult in many ways. There are huge issues there. Think about the Ottomans. Think about, this is true at least for Italy, but that was more like a maritime problem. In Germany, it was about the fact that, the Turks were really next door via land. And so that was one thing. Secondly, the Protestants. Right. In many ways, they were fringe, as we've seen in Germany, especially, but and in Europe in general. But still, like, they crippled significantly the Habsburgic efforts to recompact the German monarchy that had not really ended since the Reformation, the Middle Ages, and then you have, of course, like, foreign threats. You have general foreign intervention. Like, also for the same Protestants, for example, like, there are some, but even think about the Swiss or the Dutch, right? These are effectively lands that secede from the Holy Roman Empire. So it's a huge issue, but really mean a big one. And what can you do? It's history, but one you should. I have always the impression there is this weird progressivism and optimism in describing this period of the Renaissance as such a grandiosely, advancing time. It's, in many, yes and no. Like I love the Renaissance. There is always something to love in any historical period, but let's say the 16th century was probably the single most traumatically perceived century in the history, at least of, I could say of mankind is too much perhaps, but I'd say in a strictly Western Christian perspective, I think the 16th century, at least from late antiquity, may have been the worst. But especially because of the relative effect on the people of the time, which is debatable, but it's surely like it's not the first, the second, for sure. And you could add, of course, the 20th century was also not that good, but overall it was balanced by other readjustments. The 16th century was really messed up to a degree that it's difficult to recollect. So this is pretty much the story, and we will perhaps keep talking about this another time. In any case, for today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in upcoming content. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.